Welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through Scripture's timeless wisdom. Tonight's story follows Matthias, a weary builder in ancient Jerusalem who discovers that true strength comes not from human effort, but from divine grace. When exhaustion nearly destroys him, an encounter with Isaiah 40 transforms everything. Through his journey of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls, Matthias learns the sacred art of working in surrendered dependence, finding that those who wait upon the Lord truly do renew their strength. This 2 to 3 hour sleep story gently guides you into peaceful rest while exploring profound biblical truths about weakness, strength, and God's unfailing provision, perfect for deep sleep, meditation, or spiritual reflection. If this blesses you, please like, subscribe, and consider supporting through Super Chat. Your support helps us continue creating faith-filled content for rest and renewal. Based on Isaiah 40, Trask, Biblical Fiction, Christian Sleep Story, Faith and Rest. Hello, and welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Tonight, we will share the journey of a weary builder named Matthias, a narrative inspired by the profound words of Isaiah chapter 40. This story explores how the Lord renews our strength when we are exhausted, how He carries us when we cannot walk, and how waiting upon Him transforms weakness into power. It teaches us about divine comfort, unshakable hope, and the incomparable greatness of our Creator, who never grows tired or weary. As you listen, allow these words filled with faith to envelop you, bringing tranquility to your mind and renewal to your spirit. Let the gentle guidance of biblical wisdom lead you to a place of complete peace, resting in the presence of God. If this video blesses you, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue sharing God's wisdom through these stories, creating more content designed to bring peace and spiritual refreshment through narratives inspired by Scripture. Now, take a deep breath, settle into the presence of God, and let us begin tonight's journey through this blessed story. The sun had not yet broken over the eastern hills when Matthias pressed his weathered hands against the cool stone wall he had been rebuilding. The muscles in his shoulders ached with a depth that seemed to reach into his very bones. For 3 years now, he had worked on restoring the southern wall of Jerusalem, one stone upon another, each block requiring strength he was no longer certain he possessed. The occupation had left much of the city in disrepair, and the call had gone out for skilled builders to restore what had been broken. Matthias had answered that call, though now, in the gray light before dawn, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water skin hanging from a wooden post. The water was tepid, tasting of the clay vessel that held it, but it wet his parched throat. Around him, the city slowly awakened. He could hear the distant bleating of sheep being led out to pasture, the creak of wooden wheels on the cobblestone streets, the low murmur of morning prayers drifting from nearby homes. These sounds had once brought him comfort, the rhythm of ordinary life continuing despite hardship. But lately, they only reminded him of how tired he had become. Matthias was 43 years old, though he felt twice that age. His beard, once dark as obsidian, now carried threads of silver that caught the early light. His wife, Dinah, had died 2 winters past, taken by a fever that swept through their neighborhood like an invisible plague. His 2 sons had moved to Galilee, seeking work in the fishing trade, leaving their father alone in the small house near the potter's gate. He did not begrudge them their departure, Young men needed to make their way in the world, but their absence left a hollow space in his chest that no amount of work could fill. He returned his attention to the wall before him. This section had collapsed during a storm, the mortar weakened by years of neglect and the harsh winds that sometimes descended from the northern mountains. The project required not just physical strength, but precision. Each stone carefully selected and placed so the wall would stand for generations. It was work that demanded everything he had to give, and for months now, Matthias had felt he had nothing left to offer. The sky began to lighten, pale pink spreading across the horizon like spilled wine on linen. Matthias picked up his tools, the familiar weight of the hammer and chisel in his calloused palms. He had been a builder since his youth, learning the trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. There was honor in the work, in creating something that would outlast you, in leaving the world more stable than you found it. But honor did not ease the exhaustion that had settled into his bones like winter cold into ancient stone. As he worked, chipping away at a rough edge of limestone, a memory surfaced unbidden. He was a boy again, perhaps 8 years old, watching his father repair a breach in their courtyard wall. His father had seemed so strong then, tireless, his movements efficient and sure. Young Matthias had asked him how he never grew weary, and his father had smiled, that gentle smile he reserved for his children's questions. He had said something about finding strength beyond yourself, about roots that went deeper than any well. At the time, Matthias had not understood. Now, with his father long buried in the family tomb outside the city, those words returned to haunt him. The other builders began to arrive as the sun crested the hills. There was Ezra, a younger man with strong arms and an even stronger laugh, and old Simeon, who moved slowly, but whose hands shaped stone with the artistry of a scribe forming letters. They greeted Matthias with nods and quiet words, each man settling into his portion of the wall. The work commenced, the air soon filling with the rhythmic sound of hammers striking stone, the scrape of mortar being mixed. The occasional grunt of effort as a particularly heavy block was lifted into place. Matthias tried to match their pace, but his body would not cooperate. His arms felt leaden. His breath came shorter than it should. Twice that morning, he had to step away from the wall, sitting on a pile of discarded stones while the world spun slightly around him. Ezra noticed, bringing him water, his young face creased with concern. Matthias waved him away with words he hoped sounded reassuring, but the worry in Ezra's eyes remained. By midday, when the sun stood directly overhead and the heat pressed down like a physical weight, Matthias knew he could not continue. He set down his tools and made his way through the narrow streets toward the temple courts. He moved slowly, each step requiring conscious effort, as though he were climbing a mountain rather than walking on level ground. People passed him, some hurrying about their business, others strolling in conversation. None seemed to notice the struggle written across his features. The temple rose before him, its white limestone walls brilliant in the afternoon sun. Matthias had always found solace in this place, in the courtyard where pilgrims gathered and the Levites sang their psalms. He found a shaded corner near the eastern colonnade and lowered himself onto a stone bench. The coolness of the stone seeped through his tunic, offering small relief from the heat and his fatigue. He sat there for a long time, watching the ebb and flow of humanity. A group of priests passed, their white garments pristine, their faces set in expressions of holy concentration. A merchant argued with a money changer near the entrance, their voices rising and falling in practiced negotiation. A young mother tried to quiet her crying infant, rocking the child against her shoulder with patient determination. All of life seemed to pass before him, and he felt removed from it, as though he were watching through a veil. A voice broke through his reverie, thin and reedy with age. An elderly man had settled beside him on the bench, though Matthias had not noticed his approach. The man's face was deeply lined, his beard white as new wool, his eyes the faded blue of old denim. He wore the simple robes of a teacher, and he carried a scroll tucked under one arm. "You carry a heavy burden, my son," the old man said, his voice gentle despite its quavering quality. It was not a question, but a statement, delivered with the certainty of one who had learned to read the human heart through long years of observation. Matthias considered denying it, offering some polite dismissal, but found he lacked the energy even for that. "I am tired," he said simply, the words falling from his lips like stones into still water. "So very tired." The old man nodded slowly as though this confirmed something he had already known. "And what is it that wearies you? The work of your hands or the work of your heart?" The question struck deeper than Matthias had expected. He found himself answering with an honesty that surprised him. "Both, I think. I rebuild walls of stone, but my own walls crumble. I work until my body aches, yet I cannot outrun the emptiness. My wife is gone, my sons are distant. I am not the man I was, and I fear I will never be that man again." The old teacher was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting across the courtyard to where a group of young scholars debated some fine point of the law. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality that made Matthias lean closer, not wanting to miss a single word. "There was a time, many years ago, when our people were carried away to Babylon. They built walls for others, labored in foreign fields, sang their songs in a strange land. They too grew weary, not just in body, but in spirit. They wondered if the Lord had forgotten them, if their strength would ever return." The old man paused, his fingers absently tracing the edge of the scroll he carried. "It was in that time of deepest weariness that the prophet Isaiah brought them words of comfort. Would you like to hear them?" Matthias nodded, not trusting his voice. The old man carefully unrolled the scroll, his practiced hands finding the place he sought. He began to read, and though his voice remained thin, the words seemed to carry a weight and power far beyond the speaker. "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned." A voice cries, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together." The words washed over Matthias like cool water over heated skin. He had heard them before, certainly, in synagogue readings and festival celebrations, but now, in his exhaustion and grief, they struck him differently. Comfort, warfare ended, valleys lifted, mountains made low. He thought of the wall he was building, how each stone represented an effort to make the uneven ground level, to prepare a way. Yet here was a promise of something greater, a divine work that accomplished what human hands could never achieve alone. The old teacher continued reading, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? Who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, Or what man shows him his counsel? Whom did he consult, and who made him understand? Who taught him the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? Matthias closed his eyes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he heard. The God who measured oceans in his palm, who marked off the heavens as a man might measure cloth for a garment, who weighed mountains as a merchant weighed grain. What were his small struggles against such immensity? What was his weakness when set beside such incomprehensible strength? The old man's voice dropped lower, more intimate now, as though sharing a secret. Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are accounted as the dust on the scales. Behold, he takes up the coastlands like fine dust. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness. The words should have made Matthias feel insignificant, should have crushed him beneath the weight of his own smallness. But instead, he felt something else stirring in his chest. If the nations were as nothing, if empires and kingdoms were but dust, then perhaps his failures were not as catastrophic as they seemed. Perhaps there was a perspective from which his exhaustion, his grief, his sense of inadequacy were not the defining features of his existence. The teacher read on, and now Matthias heard challenge in the words. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness compare with him? An idol? A craftsman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold, and casts for it silver chains. He who is too impoverished for an offering chooses wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skillful craftsman to set up an idol that will not move. Do you not know? Do you not hear? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? Matthias thought of the small household gods he had seen in his neighbors' homes, the carved figures that promised protection and prosperity. He had never been drawn to such things, but now he wondered what idols he had constructed in his own heart. Had he made an idol of his own strength, believing that everything depended on his ability to work and provide? Had he placed his wife and sons on pedestals that no human being could sustain, making them the source of his meaning rather than expressions of a larger gift? The old man's voice rose slightly as he came to a passage that seemed to energize him. It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in, who brings princes to nothing and makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows on them, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. The image struck Matthias with particular force. He thought of the powerful men he had seen, the Roman officials who strutted through Jerusalem with their armor and authority, the wealthy merchants who thought their gold made them invulnerable, even the religious leaders who sometimes confused their position with divine approval. All of them were grasshoppers before the God who stretched out the heavens. All of them would wither like stubble before a strong wind. And if that was true of the powerful, what did it mean for a simple builder whose strength was failing? The teacher paused in his reading, allowing the words to settle in the air between them. Then he looked directly at Matthias, and the old man's faded eyes seemed suddenly sharp, penetrating. Listen carefully now, my son. This next part is why I was sent to you today. Matthias felt a chill, despite the afternoon heat. Sent to you, as though this encounter were not accident, but appointment. The old man's voice became even more deliberate, spacing each word as though planting seeds in prepared soil. Lift up your eyes on high and see, who created these? He who brings out their host by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? The question hung in the air, and Matthias felt it pierce him. Had he not thought exactly that? That his struggles were invisible to God, that his pain went unnoticed, that he had been abandoned to face his exhaustion alone? The words named his deepest fear, brought it into the light where he could see it clearly. But the old teacher was not finished. His voice grew stronger, and Matthias could have sworn the man looked younger as he spoke, as though the words themselves were reviving him. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. The words hit Matthias like physical blows, each one striking against the walls he had built around his heart. The Lord does not grow weary. He gives power to the faint. To him who has no might, he increases strength. This was not a call to try harder, to dig deeper within himself for reserves that no longer existed. This was a promise of strength from beyond himself, power from a source that never depleted. The old man continued, and now his voice trembled, not with age, but with emotion. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The image blossomed in Matthias's mind. Eagles soaring on currents of air, their wings spread wide but not laboring, held aloft by something greater than their own effort, running without weariness, walking without fainting, not through gritted teeth and dogged determination, but through a renewal that came from waiting upon the Lord. But what did that mean to wait? Was it passive resignation, or was it something else entirely? The old teacher rolled up his scroll with careful reverence and placed it in Matthias's hands. "Keep this for a time," he said softly. "Read it when the weariness threatens to overwhelm you. Remember that your strength is not the foundation. You are not the source. You are the vessel, and the one who fills vessels never runs dry." Before Matthias could respond, before he could even ask the old man's name, the teacher rose from the bench and disappeared into the crowd of pilgrims and worshippers. Matthias looked down at the scroll in his hands, feeling its weight, both physical and spiritual. He sat there as the afternoon lengthened, as shadows grew long across the courtyard, as the evening sacrifice was prepared and offered. The words he had heard echoed in his mind, and slowly something began to shift within him. He did not feel suddenly strong. His arms still ached. His legs still trembled with fatigue. But beneath the exhaustion, deeper than the pain, there was something new, a possibility, a hope that perhaps his weakness was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a different kind of strength. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Matthias rose from the bench and made his way home, through streets now lit by oil lamps, flickering in doorways and windows. He walked slowly, but he walked, and in the morning he would return to the wall, not because he had discovered hidden reserves of strength within himself, but because he was beginning to understand that the strength he needed did not have to come from within himself at all. The night was cool, and Matthias slept better than he had in months, the scroll from the old teacher placed carefully beside his sleeping mat. In his dreams, He saw eagles soaring, and he understood that they did not create the wind that carried them. They simply spread their wings and trusted the currents to hold them aloft. When dawn broke over Jerusalem, painting the limestone walls in shades of gold and rose, Matthias awoke with a sense of anticipation he had not felt in years. His body still ached, his muscles still protested as he rose and prepared for the day. But there was a difference now, subtle but real. He was not facing the day alone, trusting only in his own diminishing resources. He was facing it with the words of the prophet echoing in his heart. The Lord does not grow weary. He gives power to the faint. Matthias broke his fast with bread and olives, the simple food tasting somehow richer than usual. He strapped on his leather work belt, gathered his tools, and stepped out into the morning. The streets were already busy, merchants setting up their stalls, women drawing water from the public cistern, children playing in the dusty squares. Life continued its ancient rhythms, and Matthias found himself grateful to be part of it, even in his weakness. At the wall, his fellow builders were already at work. Ezra waved enthusiastically, his young face split by a wide grin. Old Simeon nodded gravely, his experienced eyes assessing Matthias with concern that softened into approval when he saw something changed in his bearing. Matthias took his place at the section he had been rebuilding, running his hand over the stone he had placed the day before. He began to work and immediately felt the limitations of his body. His arms protested, his back complained, his hands cramped around the tools. But this time, instead of fighting against the weakness, instead of berating himself for his inadequacy, he paused. He stood very still, closed his eyes, and allowed himself to remember the words from Isaiah. He does not faint or grow weary. He gives power to the faint. In the silence of his heart, Matthias did something he had not done in months. He prayed, not elaborate words or formal phrases, but simple honesty. Lord, I cannot do this alone. I am weak, but you are strong. Let your strength work through my weakness. Let me be the vessel and you be the source. When he opened his eyes and returned to his work, nothing miraculous occurred. The stones were still heavy. The labor was still demanding, but somehow he found he could continue. One stone at a time, one moment at a time, he worked. When exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he paused again, repeated the words, offered the simple prayer. And each time he found he could take the next step, lift the next stone, continue the work. Ezra noticed the change. During the midday break, as they sat in the shade of the partially completed wall, the young man brought Matthias water and asked, "What happened to you? Yesterday you looked like a man carrying the weight of the whole city. Today you still look tired, but different somehow, like the weight is being shared." Matthias smiled, the expression feeling strange on his face after so many months of grimness. "I met a teacher yesterday. He reminded me of something I had forgotten, that I was not made to carry everything alone, that there is strength beyond my own." Ezra tilted his head, curiosity evident in his features. "A teacher? What did he teach you?" Rather than trying to explain in his own words, Matthias retrieved the scroll from where he had tucked it carefully in his belt. He unrolled it to the passage that had struck him most deeply and read aloud, his voice steady despite his fatigue. "Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Ezra listened intently, and when Matthias finished reading, the young man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I am young and strong, but even I grow tired. Perhaps this is a wisdom I need to learn now, before my own strength fails me." Old Simeon, who had been listening from nearby, added his own thoughts. His voice was rough as unpolished granite, but carried the weight of lived experience. "I have built walls for 40 years. I have seen strong men broken by work that seemed endless, their bodies given out, their spirits crushed. But I have also seen weak men accomplish great things, not through their own might, but through something they drew from a deeper well. The second kind of builder creates work that lasts because it was never truly their work alone." The three men sat together in companionable silence, the scroll resting open in Matthias's lap. Around them, the sounds of construction continued, but in that moment, they had created a small sanctuary of shared understanding. The lesson of Isaiah was beginning to take root, not just in Matthias's heart, but in the hearts of those who worked beside him. The afternoon work proceeded with a different quality. Matthias found a rhythm that surprised him. He would work until he felt his strength flagging, then pause, breathe deeply, and in that breath offer his weakness to the Lord. He would remember the words, "The Lord does not faint or grow weary. He gives power to the faint." And somehow, impossibly, he would find the ability to continue. Not indefinitely, not without limits, but further than he thought possible. It was not dramatic. There were no lightning bolts or angelic visitations, but there was something real happening. Something Matthias could not fully explain but could definitely experience. It was as though his work had become a kind of prayer, each stone placed an act of trust, each moment of weakness acknowledged an opportunity for divine strength to manifest. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Matthias stepped back to assess the day's work. He had accomplished more than he expected, not through heroic effort, but through steady, sustained labor, punctuated by moments of surrender. The wall stood taller, more stable, one day closer to completion. On his way home, Matthias took a different route, one that led him through the market quarter. The stalls were still open, merchants calling out their wares, the smell of fresh bread and roasted meat mingling with the dust and press of humanity. He found himself drawn to a particular stall, where an old woman sold oil lamps of remarkable craftsmanship. He had walked past this stall many times, but had never stopped. The woman looked up as he approached, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes bright with intelligence. "You have the look of a man who has found something he had lost," she observed, her voice crackling like a warm fire. Matthias considered this. Perhaps. Or perhaps I found something I never knew I had. She smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. The best discoveries are like that. They were always there, waiting for us to recognize them. She gestured to her display of lamps. "Each of these I made with clay from the earth and fire from the kiln. But the light they give comes from oil I did not make and flame I did not create. I am just the vessel. The vessel is nothing without what fills it." Her words echoed what the old teacher had said, and Matthias felt a shiver of recognition. How many teachers had been placed in his path? How many messengers bearing the same truth in different forms? He purchased one of the lamps, a simple but elegant piece with a wide base for stability. The old woman wrapped it carefully in cloth and handed it to him with a blessing. "May your light never go out, and may you always remember the source of your flame." At home that evening, Matthias lit the new lamp and placed it in the center of his small dwelling. He prepared a simple meal of lentil stew and bread, ate slowly, savoring each bite. Then he unrolled the scroll again and began to read, not just the passages the old teacher had shared, but the entire 40th chapter of Isaiah. He read it slowly, pausing over phrases that caught his attention, allowing the words to sink deep into his spirit. One passage particularly struck him as he read, "All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows on it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever." He thought about this, about the transient nature of human strength and beauty. His own vitality, which he had taken for granted in his youth, had proven as temporary as grass in the summer heat. His wife's life, which had seemed so vibrant and permanent, had faded like a flower. Even his son's presence in his home had been fleeting, lasting only until they grew strong enough to leave. Everything human was grass, withering under the breath of time, but the Word of God stood forever. The promises remained. The comfort offered through Isaiah's prophecy did not fade with the passing generations. The God who did not grow weary in Isaiah's time did not grow weary now. The strength offered to the faint remained available, a well that never ran dry. Matthias spent the evening in meditation, the lamp casting gentle shadows on the walls of his home. He thought about the wall he was building, how it too would eventually crumble and fall, as all human works eventually do. But the character formed in the building, the trust developed in the working, the lessons learned in the weakness, these were treasures that would not fade. He was not just building a wall. He was being built into something stronger, more stable, more capable of bearing weight, because he had learned not to trust in his own strength alone. The next day began much like the previous one, but with each day that followed, Matthias found himself growing in understanding. The physical work remained difficult. There were days when his body screamed for rest, when every stone felt impossibly heavy, when he wondered if he would be able to continue. But he was learning the art of waiting upon the Lord, of pausing in his weakness to draw from a strength that was not his own. He began to share the scroll with others, reading passages to his fellow workers during their breaks. The words spread like ripples in a pool, touching hearts that were ready to receive them. Ezra copied portions of the text onto small pieces of parchment, carrying them with him as reminders. Old Simeon, who had lived by practical wisdom and craftsmanship, found himself moved by the spiritual truth the words contained. Others heard and were changed, each in their own way. Weeks passed, and the wall continued to rise. Matthias noticed something remarkable happening. His body, while still prone to fatigue, seemed to be adapting to the work in ways he had not expected. It was as though the daily practice of surrendering his weakness had opened channels for strength to flow that had been previously blocked. He was not getting younger. His muscles were not magically restored to their prime, but he was finding a way to work that was sustainable, that did not burn him out or leave him depleted. More than that, he was finding joy in the work again. The simple satisfaction of placing a stone well, of seeing the wall take shape, of knowing that his labor contributed to something larger than himself. This joy had been absent for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like. Now it returned, not as constant euphoria, but as a quiet contentment that ran beneath the surface of his days. One evening, about 6 weeks after his encounter with the old teacher in the temple courts, Matthias received an unexpected visitor. There was a knock at his door just as he was preparing his evening meal. When he opened it, he found a young man standing there, travel-worn and dusty, with a face that was hauntingly familiar. "Father," the young man said, and Matthias recognized his younger son Jacob, who had left for Galilee over a year before. Matthias embraced him, questions tumbling through his mind. Was something wrong? Why had Jacob returned? But he held his questions, pulling his son inside, offering water for washing and a place at the table. Jacob ate hungrily, and only after his immediate needs were met did he begin to explain his presence. "I heard something," Jacob said, his voice uncertain, "from a merchant who had been to Jerusalem. He spoke of a builder working on the southern wall, a man who had found new strength after years of exhaustion. He said this man shared words from the prophet Isaiah that had changed not just his own life, but the lives of those working alongside him. I knew it had to be you, Father. I had to come see if it was true." Matthias was astonished. He had not realized that word of his transformation had spread beyond the immediate circle of workers at the wall. "It is true," he said quietly, "though I would not have described it in such grand terms. I was at the end of my strength, Jacob. I could not continue. And then I was reminded of something I should have known all along, that the Lord does not grow weary, and He gives power to the faint." Jacob leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Father, I need to hear this. In Galilee the work is hard. The sea is unforgiving. My arms grow tired, my back aches, and I wonder if I made a mistake leaving the family trade. I thought distance would give me strength, but instead I feel weaker than ever. Teach me what you have learned." And so, late into the night, Matthias shared the scroll with his son. They read the words of Isaiah together, and Matthias explained how he had learned to wait upon the Lord, to offer his weakness as an opportunity for divine strength to manifest. He spoke of the daily practice of surrender, the moment-by-moment trust that had transformed his work from a burden into a form of worship. Jacob listened with the hunger of a man dying of thirst discovering a well. When Matthias finished speaking, his son sat in silence for a long time, processing what he had heard. Finally, he said, "I think I came back to Jerusalem seeking your approval, Father, hoping you would tell me I had made the right choice in leaving. But what I needed was not your approval, but this truth. I needed to know that my strength is not the measure of my worth, that there is a source of power beyond my own straining effort." Father and son embraced, and Matthias felt something heal within him that he had not fully realized was broken. The distance that had grown between them, the unspoken disappointment he had felt at his son's departure, the loneliness that had compounded his exhaustion, all of it seemed to dissolve in that moment of shared understanding. Jacob would return to Galilee, but he would go back changed, carrying the truth of Isaiah's words with him. And Matthias would remain in Jerusalem, continuing his work on the wall, but no longer feeling abandoned or alone. The next morning, Matthias took Jacob to see the wall. The section he had been rebuilding was now nearly complete, standing tall and solid, a testament to months of labor. Jacob ran his hand over the stones, feeling their stability, seeing the quality of the work. "You built this in weakness?" he asked, wonder in his voice. "I built it in surrender," Matthias corrected gently. "Every stone placed was an act of trust. Every moment I felt I could not continue became a moment to remember that He does not grow weary. This wall stands not because of my strength, but despite my weakness, and that makes it stronger than any wall I could have built in the pride of my youth." They stood together, father and son, looking at the wall as the morning sun illuminated its surface. Other workers began to arrive, greeting Matthias and welcoming Jacob. Ezra bounded over with his characteristic enthusiasm, and old Simeon offered his slow, approving nod. The community that had formed around the work and the shared words of Isaiah drew Jacob into its embrace, and for a few days he worked alongside them, learning not just techniques of building, but the deeper lesson of depending on a strength beyond his own. When Jacob finally prepared to return to Galilee, Matthias made him a gift of a copy of the scroll, carefully transcribed by a scribe Matthias had commissioned for this purpose. "Take this with you," he said. "Read it when you are weary. Share it with others who struggle. Let the truth of these words spread like ripples across water, reaching hearts that need to hear them." Jacob departed with the scroll tucked safely in his traveling pack, and Matthias watched him go with a peace he had not felt in years. His son was no longer lost to him, even though the distance between Jerusalem and Galilee remained. The words of Isaiah had built a bridge stronger than proximity, a connection rooted in shared truth rather than mere physical presence. The seasons turned. Summer's heat gave way to autumn's gentleness, and then to winter's cold. The work on the wall continued through all of it. There were days when rain turned the site into a quagmire of mud and frustration, when the stones became too slippery to handle safely, and the mortar refused to set properly. On those days, Matthias and his fellow workers would take shelter in the small shed they had constructed nearby, sitting together while the storm passed, sharing bread and conversation. It was during one such afternoon, with rain drumming steadily on the wooden roof, that Matthias found himself telling them more about the transformation he had experienced. "I used to think strength was about never stopping," he said, his voice thoughtful, as he watched water stream past the doorway, "about pushing through no matter what, about proving I could handle anything. But that kind of strength is like a cistern with no source. Eventually, it runs dry. What I'm learning now is different. It's about being connected to a spring that never fails, about drawing from a well that goes deeper than I can measure." Ezra, who had become something of a spiritual son to Matthias in recent months, leaned forward with interest. "But how do you do that practically? When you're lifting a stone and your arms are shaking, what actually changes?" Matthias considered the question carefully. "In that moment, I stop fighting against my weakness. I acknowledge it honestly before the Lord. I say, I cannot do this in my own strength. And then I lift the stone anyway, but with a different understanding. I'm not pretending to be strong. I'm allowing His strength to work through my weakness. Sometimes I can almost feel the difference. It's as though invisible hands steady mine, as though the burden becomes shared." Old Simeon, who had been quietly whittling a piece of wood, spoke up. His voice carried the authority of long experience. "My grandfather told me once that the best builders are not those who never tire, but those who have learned to rest while working. I didn't understand what he meant until I was much older, but I think it's related to what you're describing, Matthias. There's a way of working that flows from trust rather than striving. The work gets done, but you're not crushed by it." The rain continued, a steady rhythm that seemed to underscore their conversation. Another worker, a man named Tobias, who had joined the crew only a few weeks earlier, spoke hesitantly. "I came to this work running from something. My family's vineyard failed. Creditors took everything. I thought if I could just work hard enough here, prove myself strong enough, I could rebuild what was lost. But I'm exhausted all the time, and I can't seem to work fast enough to quiet the voices in my head telling me I'm a failure." Matthias met his eyes with compassion. "Would you like to hear the words that changed everything for me?" Tobias nodded, and Matthias retrieved the scroll. now worn from frequent handling and sharing. He had long since memorized the passages, but there was something powerful about reading directly from the text. He unrolled it carefully and began to read, his voice steady and warm. "Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength." The words filled the small shed, and the other workers grew still, listening. Matthias continued, his voice gaining strength as he read, "Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." When he finished, there was a long silence broken only by the sound of rain. Tobias had tears streaming down his face, and even the more stoic workers seemed moved. It was as though the words had touched something deep within each of them, speaking to exhaustions and fears they had not known how to name. "I have been trying to be my own God," Tobias said finally, his voice breaking, "trying to be the source of my own restoration. But I'm not a God. I'm a man who needs help, who needs strength beyond himself." He looked at Matthias. "Can I copy those words? I want to carry them with me." From that day forward, the scroll became a kind of communal treasure among the workers. They would pass it around during breaks, reading passages aloud to one another, discussing what the words meant in the context of their daily labor. The wall project began to take on a different character. It was still hard work, still demanding, but there was a new spirit among the men. They prayed together before beginning each day, simple prayers acknowledging their weakness and asking for strength. They reminded one another of the words when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. And slowly, imperceptibly, they were all being transformed. The rainy season passed, and spring brought renewed energy to the project. Wildflowers appeared in the crevices of old walls, their bright colors a testament to life's persistence. The mornings grew warmer, the light softer, and the work progressed steadily. Matthias found that his body, while still prone to fatigue, had adapted in remarkable ways. He was no longer the young man he had been, but he had discovered a different kind of endurance, one rooted not in physical prowess, but in spiritual resilience. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of amber and crimson, Matthias stood back to survey the completed section of wall. It stood solid and strong, each stone perfectly placed, the mortar joints tight and true. This wall would stand for generations, protecting the city, bearing witness to the dedication of those who built it. But more importantly, it stood as a testament to a deeper truth, that the greatest works are accomplished not through human strength alone, but through partnership with the divine. A delegation arrived from the city council the next morning to inspect the work. They walked along the length of the completed section, examining the craftsmanship, testing the stability. The lead inspector, a stern man named Eleazar, who was known for his exacting standards, spent a long time studying the wall before finally turning to address the workers. "This is exceptional work," he said, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. "I have inspected many building projects in this city, but rarely have I seen such quality. The wall is not only structurally sound, but beautiful in its proportions. You should be proud of what you have accomplished." Matthias stepped forward, representing the crew. "We are grateful for your approval, but we cannot take full credit. This wall stands through grace as much as effort. We learned during its construction that the greatest strength comes not from within ourselves, but from beyond ourselves. Eleazar raised an eyebrow, intrigued. An unusual philosophy for a builder. Most claim complete credit for their work. Perhaps that is why so much work fails, Matthias replied gently. When we rely solely on human strength and wisdom, we build on a foundation that shifts and cracks. But when we acknowledge our limitations and draw on divine strength, we build on bedrock. The inspector was quiet for a moment, then said, "There are other sections of the wall that need restoration. The northern sections in particular. Would you and your crew be willing to continue the work?" Matthias looked at his fellow workers. Ezra nodded enthusiastically. Old Simeon gave his slow, approving gesture. Tobias smiled, a new confidence visible in his bearing. Others voiced their agreement. Matthias turned back to Eleazar. "We will continue, but on one condition, that we may work according to the principles we have learned. We will not sacrifice quality for speed, and we will take time to rest and renew our strength. We will work as men who understand their limitations and depend on grace." To his surprise, Eleazar agreed immediately. "I care only about results. If your methods produce walls like this, then work as you see fit." And so, the project expanded. The crew moved to the northern sections, and as they did, their reputation spread. Other workers, hearing of the unusual atmosphere and approach, asked to join them. The group grew, and with it, the practice of sharing the words from Isaiah, of praying together, of supporting one another through weakness, rather than pretending strength they did not possess. Among the new workers was a young apprentice named Asher, barely 16, whose father had died in a construction accident. The boy carried a deep fear of following in his father's footsteps, but felt compelled to learn the trade to support his widowed mother and younger siblings. He worked with fierce determination, but with a terror in his eyes that never quite disappeared. Matthias noticed the boy's fear and took him under his wing. During breaks, he would sit with Asher, teaching him not just the techniques of building, but the deeper lessons he had learned. He gave the boy a copy of the Isaiah passages, carefully transcribed by a scribe. "Your father's death was a tragedy," Matthias told him one afternoon as they sat in the shade of the partially completed wall. "And your fear is understandable, but you do not have to carry this burden alone. The Lord who gives strength to the faint does not abandon the fatherless. He will be your father's house when your earthly father is gone." Asher clutched the scroll, his young face working to hold back tears. "But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail and my family suffers?" "Then you will be in good company," Matthias said with a gentle smile. "I failed my family in many ways after my wife died. I let grief and exhaustion drive me into isolation. But I learned that our failures do not define us. What defines us is whether we turn to the Lord in our weakness or try to hide it in pride." Over the following weeks, Matthias watched as Asher slowly transformed. The terror in his eyes diminished, replaced by a cautious hope. The boy's work improved, not because he suddenly became physically stronger, but because he stopped working from a place of fear and began working from a place of trust. He learned to pause when overwhelmed, to breathe, to remember the words, to pray simply and honestly. One day, while Asher was struggling with a particularly heavy stone, trying to maneuver it into a difficult position, Matthias saw him stop, close his eyes briefly, and then try again. This time, an older worker named Benjamin, seeing the struggle, moved to help without being asked. Together, they lifted the stone into place perfectly. When Asher opened his eyes, there were tears on his cheeks. "I prayed for help," he said wonderingly, "and help came. "That is how it works," Matthias replied. "Not always in the way we expect, and not always immediately, but the Lord provides. Sometimes through miraculous intervention, more often through the hands and hearts of others. We are His strength to one another." As summer deepened and the work on the northern wall progressed, Matthias received word that his older son, David, was returning from Galilee for the Festival of Tabernacles. The message brought a flutter of anticipation mixed with all old fears. His relationship with David had always been more complicated than with Jacob. David was more like his mother, intense and passionate, quick to judge and slow to forgive. They had parted on difficult terms, with words spoken in grief that both regretted, but neither knew how to take back. When David arrived, travel worn and sun-darkened from his work in Galilee, he and Matthias stood facing each other in the small courtyard of the house. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then David's face crumpled, and he stepped forward, embracing his father with fierce desperation. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice muffled against Matthias's shoulder. "I'm so sorry for leaving when you needed me, for the things I said, for my pride." Matthias held his son, feeling years of pain and distance dissolving in that embrace. "I am sorry, too, for my anger, for my bitterness, for making you feel you had to escape to breathe. I was drowning, and I nearly pulled you under with me." They stood there in the courtyard as the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the stones. Two men who had hurt each other, learning to forgive, learning to be vulnerable, learning to rebuild what had been broken between them. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears on their faces, but also smiles. "Jacob told me what happened to you," David said, "about the teacher at the temple, about the words from Isaiah, about how you've changed. I didn't fully believe it. I thought perhaps he was exaggerating, seeing what he wanted to see, but I can see it in your eyes, Father. You're different. You're at peace in a way I've never seen." Matthias nodded slowly. "I am different, not because I became stronger, but because I finally accepted my weakness, not because I solved all my problems, but because I stopped trying to be God and allowed God to be God. The words that changed me, I want to share them with you, not to preach at you, but to offer you the same gift that was offered to me." They spent the evening together, and Matthias read the entire 40th chapter of Isaiah aloud. David listened with an intensity that reminded Matthias of the boy David had been, curious and seeking, before grief and pain had hardened him. When Matthias finished reading, David sat in silence for a long time, staring into the oil lamp's flame. "I've been angry at God," he finally said, "for taking Mother, for the hardship, for everything that fell apart. I came to Galilee thinking I could outrun that anger, but it followed me. I worked until my hands bled, pushed myself beyond exhaustion, as though I could somehow earn my way back to peace. But it never worked. I just became more tired, more bitter." "I understand," Matthias said quietly. "I did the same thing. But anger at God is not the problem, David. God is big enough to handle our anger. The problem is when we try to solve our anger by becoming our own gods, by depending entirely on ourselves, by refusing to admit we need help. That's when we truly lose our way." David looked at his father with something like wonder. "When did you become wise?" Matthias laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. "I'm not wise. I'm just a tired builder who finally learned to stop fighting against his own limitations. But there is wisdom available to those who seek it, and it comes from a source much deeper than human understanding." The Festival of Tabernacles arrived, and Matthias took both his sons to the temple for the celebrations. The city was filled with pilgrims from every corner of the land, and the air rang with songs of praise and thanksgiving. They built a temporary shelter in their courtyard, as was the custom, and lived in it for the duration of the festival, remembering the wilderness years when their ancestors had lived in tents, depending entirely on divine provision. On the final day of the festival, during the water-drawing ceremony, Matthias stood with his sons among the crowd as the priests performed the ancient ritual, pouring water from the pool of Siloam onto the altar, while the Levites sang psalms. The symbolism was powerful. God as the source of living water, the people as those who must drink or die. As the water flowed and the singing rose, Matthias felt something break open within him, a final release of control, a complete surrender to the flow of grace. Tears streamed down his face, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of homecoming. He had spent so many years trying to be the source, trying to provide everything from his own resources, trying to be strong enough, wise enough, good enough. And he had failed, as all humans must eventually fail when they try to play God. But in his failure, he had found something infinitely better: dependence on the one who never fails, who never grows weary, who is the eternal source of all strength and wisdom and goodness. Beside him, his sons were weeping too. David clutched the scroll Matthias had given him, his knuckles white with the intensity of his grip. Jacob had his arm around his brother's shoulders. And in that moment, Matthias understood that the true wall he had been rebuilding all this time was not made of stone at all. It was the wall of his own heart, broken by grief and exhaustion and isolation. And the Lord had been patiently restoring it, one day at a time, one stone at a time, through the simple practice of surrender and trust. After the festival, David announced his intention to stay in Jerusalem for a time before returning to Galilee. He wanted to work on the wall project with his father, to learn the lessons Matthias had learned, to experience for himself what it meant to draw strength from a source beyond himself. Matthias welcomed him gladly, and the next morning, father and son walked together to the northern wall site. The other workers greeted David warmly, including him in their circle without question. Ezra, always enthusiastic, immediately began explaining the techniques they had developed. Old Simeon assessed David with his practiced eye and nodded approval. Asher, the young apprentice, looked at David with something like awe, recognizing in him someone who had traveled far and now chose to return. The work that day was particularly demanding. They were raising a section that required large cornerstone blocks, each weighing more than 3 men could comfortably lift. It required coordination, timing, and sustained effort. Halfway through the morning, David faltered, his legs shaking, sweat pouring down his face. Matthias saw his son's jaw clench with determination, saw him preparing to push through with sheer willpower. "David," he called out gently, "stop, breathe." David looked at his father, frustration evident in his expression. "But we need to get this stone placed. The others are waiting." "We can wait," Ezra said easily. "We're not in a race." Matthias moved to his son's side. "This is the moment. This is where you choose. Do you push through in your own strength until you break, or do you pause, acknowledge your weakness, and draw from the well that never runs dry?" David's face worked through several emotions: pride, resistance, fear, and finally, surrender. He closed his eyes, and Matthias could see his lips moving in silent prayer. When he opened his eyes, something had shifted. "I can't do this alone," he said simply. "None of us can," old Simeon replied. "That's the secret the young always have to learn. Now, Let's lift this stone together, not in our strength, but trusting that what we need will be provided. They positioned themselves around the massive stone, and at Simeon's signal, they lifted. It was still heavy, still demanding, but there was a quality to the effort that was different. Each man gave what he could, no more and no less, and trusted that it would be enough. And it was. The stone rose, settled into position, and was secured. They stepped back, breathing hard but not defeated, exhausted but not broken. David stood, staring at the placed stone and then at his hands, as though seeing them for the first time. "I felt it," he whispered. "What you described. It was like the weight was shared, like there were more than just our hands lifting." "Yes," Matthias said simply. "That is grace. That is what it means to let His strength perfect itself in our weakness." The days that followed established a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Each morning, the crew would gather before beginning work, and someone would read from the Isaiah scroll. They had expanded their collection to include other texts as well, psalms of trust, passages from the Torah about God's faithfulness, words of the prophets promising strength to the weary. But Isaiah 40 remained the heart of their practice, the words that had first opened their eyes to this way of working and living. Then they would pray, simple, honest prayers that acknowledged their limitations and asked for help. And then they would work, pausing throughout the day whenever exhaustion threatened, remembering the words, reconnecting with the source of strength beyond themselves. The work progressed steadily, and the northern wall began to take shape, rising course by course toward completion. Word continued to spread about the unusual crew working on Jerusalem's walls. Religious leaders came to observe, some skeptical, others intrigued. One Sabbath, a prominent Pharisee named Nicodemus came to the synagogue where Matthias and his crew worshipped. After the service, he approached Matthias with questions. "I have heard that you and your workers have discovered some new method of building," Nicodemus said, his tone careful, neither hostile nor fully open. "That you claim divine assistance in your labor." Matthias chose his words carefully, aware that he was speaking to a man of great learning. "We have discovered nothing new, honored teacher. We have simply learned to apply old truths in practical ways. The prophet Isaiah wrote that the Lord gives power to the faint, that those who wait upon Him shall renew their strength. We have found this to be literally true in our daily work." "But how does it function?" Nicodemus pressed. "What is the mechanism? The Lord does not physically lift stones." "Doesn't He?" Matthias replied gently. "When I surrender my weakness to Him and ask for strength, and then find I can continue when I thought I could not, is that not the Lord lifting the stone through me? When a fellow worker, moved by compassion, comes to help without being asked, is that not the Lord's hands extended? When we work from peace rather than anxiety and find our work improves, is that not divine wisdom guiding human hands?" Nicodemus was quiet, considering. "You speak of faith made practical. I speak of faith made real," Matthias corrected respectfully. "For too long, I separated my spiritual life from my working life. I prayed in the synagogue and strained in the workplace, but they are not separate. Every moment is an opportunity to depend on God, to draw from His strength, to walk in His provision. The wall we are building is as much a spiritual work as a physical one." The Pharisee nodded slowly. "I would like to see this for myself. May I visit your worksite?" "You would be most welcome," Matthias replied. The following week, Nicodemus arrived at the northern wall, accompanied by two of his students. He came early, observing as the crew gathered for their morning devotions. He listened as young Asher read from the scroll, his voice still uncertain, but growing in confidence. He watched as they prayed, these rough builders speaking to God with the intimacy of children talking to a beloved Father. And then he observed, as they worked, what struck Nicodemus most was not any miraculous intervention, but rather the quality of their interaction with one another. They worked with efficiency, but without anxiety. They helped each other readily, without keeping score. When someone struggled, others responded immediately, not with judgment, but with support. When they paused to rest and pray, there was no guilt or shame about acknowledging weakness, only an honest recognition of human limitation and divine provision. At the midday meal, Nicodemus sat with the workers, eating the simple fare they shared. "I came expecting to find either charlatans claiming false miracles or deluded men mistaking coincidence for divine action," he admitted. "But I see neither. What I see is something much more profound, men who have learned to integrate faith into every aspect of their lives, who have discovered that dependence on God is not weakness, but wisdom." "It is the hardest and easiest thing I have ever done," Matthias said. "Hardest because it requires daily dying to pride and self-sufficiency. Easiest because once you surrender, the burden truly becomes light. The yoke truly becomes easy." Nicodemus departed that afternoon with much to contemplate. But he was not the only visitor. Others came. Other builders seeking to learn, religious seekers looking for practical spirituality, even some Roman officials curious about the unusual efficiency and quality of the work. To all, Matthias and his crew offered the same message. True strength comes not from human striving, but from divine grace accessed through humble dependence. As autumn approached and the agricultural cycle turned toward harvest, the northern wall neared completion. The project that had seemed impossible when Matthias first stood before the southern wall, exhausted and despairing, was now almost finished. 2 major sections of Jerusalem's defenses had been rebuilt, standing strong and beautiful, a testimony to what grace-empowered work could accomplish. One evening, as the sun set behind the western hills and painted the limestone walls in shades of gold and rose, Matthias climbed to the top of the completed northern section. From this vantage point, he could see much of the city spread before him, the temple with its gleaming stones, the narrow streets winding between ancient buildings, the people moving about their evening rituals, the smoke of cooking fires rising into the darkening sky. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the exhaustion that had nearly destroyed him, the encounter with the old teacher who had shared words of life, the slow transformation as he learned to live those words daily, the healing of relationships with his sons, the formation of a community of workers who had become brothers, the countless stones lifted not in his own strength, but in surrendered dependence on divine power. "Thank you," he whispered to the evening sky, "for not giving up on me when I had given up on myself, for being strong when I was weak, for teaching me that my weakness is not a problem to be solved, but an opportunity for your strength to be revealed." Behind him, he heard footsteps and turned to find David climbing to join him. His son had stayed in Jerusalem for several months now, and the change in him was remarkable. The hard edge of anger and bitterness had softened. He laughed more readily. He spoke of returning to Galilee not as an escape, but as a calling, carrying with him the lessons learned on the walls of Jerusalem. "Father," David said, standing beside him and looking out over the city, "I want to thank you." "For what?" "For showing me that weakness acknowledged is stronger than strength pretended, for teaching me that faith is not about having all the answers, but about knowing where to find them, for being honest about your own struggles instead of pretending to have it all together. That honesty gave me permission to be honest, too. Matthias felt his throat tighten with emotion. I wish I had learned these lessons earlier. Perhaps your mother would have known me better. Perhaps you and Jacob would not have felt you needed to leave. David shook his head. No, Father. The timing was what it needed to be. We all had our own journeys to walk. Mother knew you loved her, even if you didn't always know how to show it. And Jacob and I needed to leave to discover who we were apart from you. But now we can return, not as boys seeking approval, but as men who have found their own relationship with the Lord. That's a gift you've given us, even if it came through pain. They stood together in silence as the stars began to appear, tiny points of light emerging from the gathering darkness. Matthias thought of the old teacher's words about the God who measured the heavens with a span, who brought out the stars by number, calling each by name. That same God knew Matthias by name, knew David, knew every person in the city below, knew their struggles and their strengths, their fears and their hopes. I'm going to start a building crew in Galilee, David said after a while, following the same principles we've practiced here. There's so much work to be done and so many workers who are exhausted and discouraged. I want to show them what you showed me, that there's another way, that strength renewed is better than strength pretended. That is good work, Matthias replied warmly. The walls we build will eventually crumble, but the hearts we help rebuild will stand forever. Take copies of the scroll with you. Share the words freely. Let them spread like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever there is soil ready to receive them. The conversation turned to practical matters. How to organize such a crew, how to teach these principles, how to maintain the balance between getting work done and nurturing spiritual depth. They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming, father and son united not just by blood, but by shared vision and purpose. The final weeks of work on the northern wall were marked by a bittersweet quality. The crew knew that completion would mean the end of this particular community, even as they celebrated the accomplishment. Some would move to other projects. Some would return to their home villages. Some, like David, would carry the vision to new locations. The bonds they had formed would not be broken, but they would be transformed. On the day they placed the final stone, the entire crew gathered for a ceremony. They invited their families, friends from the community, even some of the city officials who had commissioned the work. Old Simeon, as the most experienced builder, had the honor of setting the last stone. But before he did, he called for silence. "This wall will stand long after we are gone," he said, his rough voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "But it is not our memorial. Let anyone who looks at this wall in years to come know that it was built not by men alone, but by men who learned to work in partnership with the divine. Let it stand as testimony that the Lord gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength." Then together the entire crew recited the words from Isaiah that had become their foundation. "Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Their voices rose together, dozens of men who had learned these words not just intellectually, but experientially, who had proven their truth in the daily crucible of physical labor and personal limitation. The words echoed off the newly completed wall, seeming to resonate in the very stones they had placed. When the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Matthias walked the length of both walls, south and north, tracing with his hand the stones he had helped place. Each one represented not just physical effort, but spiritual lesson. Each joint spoke of surrender and trust. Each course testified to grace sufficient for each day's need. He thought of himself 3 years earlier, standing before the southern wall in darkness and despair, certain he could not continue, ready to give up entirely. If someone had told him then what he would accomplish, what he would learn, how he would be transformed, he would not have believed it, not because the goals were too high, but because he had seen only his own weakness and not the divine strength available to work through that weakness. That evening, Matthias hosted a final gathering at his home. The house that had felt so empty after Dinah's death, that had echoed with loneliness when his sons departed, was now filled with people and warmth and fellowship. Workers and their families crowded into every room and spilled out into the courtyard. Food was shared, bread and wine, olives and cheese, roasted lamb and fresh vegetables. Stories were told, laughter rang out, and prayers of thanksgiving were offered. At some point in the evening, young Asher stood up, clutching the scroll Matthias had given him months before. "I want to say something," he announced, his voice nervous but determined. "Before I came to this crew, I was terrified every day, terrified I would fail, terrified I would let my family down, terrified I would die like my father. But Matthias taught me something that changed everything. He taught me that I don't have to be enough by myself, that the Lord's strength shows up most clearly in my weakness, that asking for help is not shameful, but wise." The young man's voice grew stronger as he continued. "My father was a good man and a skilled builder, but he tried to do everything in his own strength. He pushed himself beyond reason, took unnecessary risks, and paid the ultimate price. I don't want to follow that path. I want to build the way we've learned here, acknowledging limitations, depending on grace, working in community. And someday, when I have sons of my own, I'll teach them not just how to place stones, but how to live in the strength that comes from beyond themselves." There was deep silence when he finished, and then someone began to sing. It was one of the psalms they had learned to love during their work, a song of trust and thanksgiving. Others joined in, and soon the entire gathering was singing, their voices rising into the night sky, a chorus of men and women who had learned that human weakness and divine strength are not opposites, but partners, not contradictions, but complements. As the evening deepened and guests gradually departed, Matthias found himself alone with his sons and old Simeon. They sat together in the courtyard, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening vault of heaven. "You know what strikes me most about all this?" Simeon said thoughtfully. "We set out to build a wall, and we did. But the Lord used that wall to build something more important. He built us. We are not the same men who started this project. We have been shaped and formed just as surely as we shaped and formed the stones." "That has always been God's way," Matthias replied. "He works through our work. He teaches us through our tasks. The wall was never just about defense or civic pride. It was about a group of men learning to depend on Him, learning to support each other, learning that true strength is found in surrender." Jacob, who had been quiet most of the evening, spoke up. "When I return to Galilee tomorrow, I carry something more valuable than any skill or technique. I carry the knowledge that I am not alone, that I am not the source, that there is strength available to me that will never run dry. That changes everything, not just my work, but my entire life. David nodded agreement. I spent so many years trying to prove myself, trying to be strong enough, good enough, capable enough. It was exhausting and it was futile. What I learned here is that I don't have to prove anything. I just have to show up, acknowledge my need, and trust that what I need will be provided. That's not passivity. We've worked harder than ever. But it's work from a different place, work that doesn't crush the spirit even as it challenges the body. They sat in comfortable silence, 4 men at different stages of life, but united by shared experience and mutual understanding. The courtyard was quiet now except for the distant sounds of the city settling into sleep. A dog barking, a child's cry quickly soothed, the murmur of voices from nearby homes, the soft rustle of wind through leaves. "What will you do now?" Simeon asked Matthias. "The wall is complete. Other workers will maintain it. Your sons return to Galilee. What comes next for you?" Matthias had been pondering this question himself. "I think I will continue to build, but perhaps not always walls of stone. There are other things that need building: community, hope, faith. I want to be available to teach anyone who wishes to learn, not just the craft of masonry, but the art of drawing strength from beyond ourselves. And I want to write down our story so that others who come after might benefit from what we learned." "That is good work," Simeon affirmed. "The greatest teachers are those who have learned through their own struggles, who can speak not from theory, but from lived experience. You have earned the right to teach because you first learned to be taught." As the night deepened, they eventually parted ways. David and Jacob to their sleeping mats, preparing for their early departure. Simeon to his nearby home, walking slowly with the careful steps of a man who had learned to pace himself, who knew that hurrying served no purpose. Matthias to his own sleeping mat, where he lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of his house settling, the distant barking of a dog, the whisper of wind through the olive trees in his small courtyard. He did not sleep immediately. Instead, he lay there replaying the entire journey in his mind, from that first morning when he could barely lift a stone, through the encounter with the old teacher, through the months of learning to work in surrendered dependence, through the healing with his sons, through the formation of this unlikely community of builders who had become brothers. Each memory was a stone in its own right, carefully placed in the structure of his transformation. In the morning, both David and Jacob departed for Galilee. Matthias stood at the city gate, watching them disappear down the road, 2 figures growing smaller against the vast landscape of hills and valleys. But this time, there was no ache of abandonment in his chest, no sense of being left behind. They carried with them not just the scroll of Isaiah, but the living testimony of transformation. They would plant seeds in Galilee that would grow in their own time, in their own way. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm for Matthias. With the northern wall complete and no immediate commission for another major project, he found himself with time he had not had in years. Rather than seeking immediately to fill it with more work, he allowed himself the gift of rest, not idleness, but true Sabbath rest, the kind that restores not just the body, but the soul. He began spending mornings in the temple courts, not working, but simply being present. He would sit in his favorite spot near the eastern colonnade, the same place where the old teacher had found him months before, and he would watch the flow of humanity. Priests and pilgrims, merchants and mothers, scholars and seekers, all passed before him like a living river of human experience. And increasingly, people began to seek him out. It started with Ezra, who would come during his breaks from other building projects, wanting to talk about how to apply the lessons they had learned. Then Tobias brought a friend, another worker struggling with exhaustion and despair. Then a young woman came, having heard from her brother about the builder who had found peace in his weakness, wanting to know if such peace was available to women as well. Matthias never set himself up as a teacher in any formal sense. He had no credentials, no rabbinical training, no authority beyond his own experience. But he had something perhaps more valuable. He had walked through the valley and emerged on the other side. He had been broken and remade. He had learned truths not from books alone, but through the crucible of lived experience. His method of teaching was simple. He would listen, really listen, to each person's story. He would let them speak their exhaustion, their fear, their sense of inadequacy. And then, when the moment was right, he would share the words from Isaiah. Sometimes he would tell stories from the wall building, moments when divine strength had manifested through human weakness. Other times, he would simply read the passages slowly, letting the words do their own work. One afternoon, a wealthy merchant named Ezekiel came to him. The man was dressed in fine linen, his fingers adorned with rings, his bearing that of someone accustomed to command and control. But his eyes were haunted, carrying a weariness that wealth could not alleviate. "I have heard of you," Ezekiel said without preamble. "They say you were a builder who could no longer build, and that somehow you found strength to continue. I am a merchant who can no longer bear the burden of my trade. I have wealth, I have success, but I have no peace. Can your God help someone like me?" Matthias gestured for the man to sit beside him on the stone bench. "Tell me," he said gently, "what is the nature of your burden?" The merchant's carefully constructed facade cracked. "I have spent 20 years building my business. I have caravans traveling from Egypt to Damascus, warehouses full of goods, employees depending on me. But the weight of it all is crushing me. Every night I lie awake calculating profits and losses, worrying about bandits and weather and market fluctuations. I cannot remember the last time I truly rested. My wife says I am becoming a stranger to her and our children. My body aches constantly. My mind races even when I try to pray. I am wealthy and successful and utterly exhausted." Matthias nodded slowly, recognizing in this wealthy merchant the same fundamental struggle he had faced. The burden you carry is not about wealth or poverty, about building walls or building businesses. It is about trying to be the source rather than the vessel. You have made yourself responsible for outcomes that are not ultimately yours to control. You are trying to be God of your own small universe, and that is a weight no human was meant to carry. Ezekiel looked at him sharply. "But if I do not carry it, who will? My family depends on my success. My workers need their wages. My reputation rests on my reliability. And all of that is important," Matthias agreed. "But you have confused responsibility with control. You are responsible for doing your work with integrity, for treating people fairly, for making wise decisions. But you are not responsible for outcomes you cannot control. The weather, the bandits, the market shifts, those belong to God. When you try to control what only God can control, you place upon yourself a burden that will eventually crush you." The merchant was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the temple courtyard. "So what do I do? simply stop caring about my business? No, Matthias said. You care deeply, but you care differently. Let me share with you words that changed my life. He unrolled his worn scroll and began to read, his voice steady and warm. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. As he continued reading the familiar words, Matthias watched the merchant's face. He saw the initial skepticism, then curiosity, then something like hunger. When he reached the final verses, they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Tears were streaming down Ezekiel's weathered cheeks. I have heard these words before, the merchant whispered, many times in synagogue, but I never truly heard them. I thought they were poetry, beautiful but impractical. But you are saying they are literally true? That I can actually access this strength? I am saying more than that, Matthias replied. I am saying that you cannot not access it. You were never meant to operate from your own limited resources. The question is not whether divine strength is available, but whether you will acknowledge your need for it and open yourself to receive it. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, and Matthias shared his own story in detail, the exhaustion, the encounter with the old teacher, the months of learning to work in surrendered dependence. He explained the practical rhythms he had developed, the morning prayers acknowledging his weakness, the throughout the day pauses to reconnect with the source, the evening gratitude for strength that was not his own. Ezekiel listened with the intensity of a man drowning who had just been thrown a rope. When Matthias finished, the merchant sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Will you teach me, not just today, but over time? I need to learn this not as theory, but as practice. I need to rewire how I think about work, about success, about my own role in my life. I will walk with you, Matthias agreed. But understand, I am not a rabbi or a sage. I am simply a builder who learned he could not build in his own strength. What I can offer is companionship on the journey and testimony to what I have experienced. The real teacher is the Spirit of God, working through the words of Scripture and the circumstances of your life. From that day forward, Ezekiel became a regular visitor. He would come in the early mornings before his business day began, and he and Matthias would walk together through the city streets or sit in the temple courts. They would read the Isaiah passages together, discuss how to apply them to the specific challenges Ezekiel faced, and pray simple, honest prayers acknowledging dependence on God. The transformation was not immediate or dramatic, but it was real. Over weeks and months, Matthias watched as the haunted look gradually left Ezekiel's eyes, as the tension in his shoulders began to ease, as a smile, genuine and unforced, became more common on his face. The merchant learned to pause throughout his day, to breathe deeply and remember that he was not the source. He learned to make decisions from a place of peace rather than anxiety. He learned to delegate more, trusting that God could work through others as well as through him. And Ezekiel's transformation rippled outward. His workers noticed the change in him and responded with greater loyalty and dedication. His wife and children found themselves welcomed back into his life as he learned to be present rather than perpetually preoccupied. His business, paradoxically, became more successful as he worried about it less, because his decisions were clearer, his judgment less clouded by anxiety. One evening, several months into their friendship, Ezekiel invited Matthias to his home for dinner. It was a grand house in the upper city, with spacious rooms and beautiful furnishings, but it had a warmth that wealth alone could never create. Ezekiel's wife Miriam greeted Matthias with genuine affection. "You have given me back my husband," she said simply. "For that I will be forever grateful." During the meal, surrounded by Ezekiel's family, Matthias was struck by how far the ripples of that one encounter with the old teacher had spread. One weary builder receiving words of life, and now those words were transforming not just himself, but everyone he touched. The workers at the wall, his sons in Galilee, this wealthy merchant and his family, and through them, countless others. After dinner, Ezekiel brought out a beautifully crafted scroll. "I had this made for you," he said, handing it to Matthias. "It is Isaiah chapter 40, the entire text, inscribed by the finest scribe in Jerusalem. But more than that, in the margins, I have had him record the names of everyone whose life has been changed by these words through your testimony, your fellow builders, my family, others who have heard and been transformed." Matthias unrolled the scroll with trembling hands. The text of Isaiah was there in beautiful Hebrew script, and in the margins, column after column of names. Some he recognized: Ezra, Simeon, Asher, Tobias, David, Jacob. Others were unknown to him. People who had heard the word second hand or third hand, seeds planted by seeds he had planted. There were dozens of names, and Ezekiel explained that this was just the beginning, just those they knew about. How many others had been touched in ways they would never hear about? "This is not my doing," Matthias said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am just a conduit, a clay vessel through which living water has flowed. But I am grateful beyond words to have been used this way." "You are more than a conduit," Miriam said gently. "You are a testimony. When people look at you, they see a man who was broken and has been remade. They see peace in your eyes, strength in your weakness, joy in your simplicity. That testimony gives them hope that transformation is possible for them too." As the seasons cycled once more, winter giving way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, Matthias continued his quiet ministry in the temple courts and throughout the city. He never sought attention or acclaim. He simply made himself available, sitting in his usual spot, open to whoever God might send his way. And people came, workers and merchants, widows and orphans, priests and prostitutes, Jews and Gentiles. The words of Isaiah seemed to transcend every barrier of class and culture, speaking to the universal human experience of weakness and the universal divine offer of strength. One day, nearly a year after the completion of the northern wall, Matthias received a message from his son Jacob. It came via a traveling merchant who had been in Galilee. The message was brief but joyful. Jacob had married a woman from Capernaum, and they were expecting a child. More than that, Jacob had formed a building crew following the principles they had learned in Jerusalem, and the work was prospering. David, too, was thriving, using his crew not just to build structures, but to build men, teaching them to work from a place of surrendered dependence. Matthias read the message multiple times, each reading bringing fresh joy. His sons were not just surviving, but flourishing, and they were passing on the legacy not of technique, but of truth. Whatever else he accomplished in his life, this would be enough. To have learned these lessons himself, and to have passed them on to his sons. That evening, Matthias walked to the southern wall, the first section he had worked on, the place where his transformation had begun. He ran his hand over the stones, feeling their solid permanence. The wall stood as strong as the day it had been completed, testament to quality work done in right relationship with the source of all strength. He thought about the old teacher who had first shared the words of Isaiah with him. Who was that man? Where had he come from? Why had he chosen that particular day, that particular moment, to sit beside a broken builder and offer words of life? Matthias had never seen him again after that first encounter, despite many hours spent in the temple courts. It was as though he had appeared for that single purpose and then vanished. Some might say it was coincidence, random chance that brought them together at the right moment. But Matthias knew better. There are no accidents in the kingdom of God, no meaningless encounters, no wasted moments. That old teacher had been sent, as surely as angels are sent, to deliver a message to one who needed to hear it. And Matthias, in turn, had become a messenger to others. As autumn deepened and the festival of tabernacles approached once more, Matthias began to feel a stirring in his spirit. It was time, he sensed, to put into writing the story of his transformation, not for glory or recognition, but so that the testimony would not be lost, so that future generations might read and be encouraged. He purchased parchment and ink, and in the quiet hours of early morning and late evening, he began to write. He wrote about the exhaustion that had nearly destroyed him, about the encounter in the temple courts, about learning to work in weakness, about the healing with his sons, about the countless people whose lives had been touched by these ancient words, made new. The writing itself became a form of prayer, a way of offering back to God the gift he had been given. Each word was chosen carefully, each sentence crafted to carry not just information, but testimony, not just facts, but truth. He wrote not as a scholar, but as a witness, describing what he had seen and experienced, what he had learned in the crucible of exhaustion and surrender. The work took months. Matthias would write until his hand cramped, then set aside the parchment and return to his daily rhythms. Mornings in the temple courts, conversations with seekers, occasional building projects when his skills were needed. But the writing was always there in the background, a steady current running through his days. As he wrote, he found himself understanding his own journey more deeply. The act of putting experience into words required reflection, analysis, the drawing of connections he had not fully seen while living through the experiences themselves. He came to see how every moment, even the most painful and difficult, had been necessary, how each stone of experience had been carefully placed by divine hands to build him into the man he was becoming. One section of the manuscript particularly absorbed him, the practical application of Isaiah's principles to daily life. He wrote detailed instructions based on what he had learned, how to pause in moments of exhaustion, what prayers to pray, how to recognize when you were straining in your own strength versus resting in divine provision, how to work from peace rather than anxiety. He wrote about the importance of community, about not trying to walk this path alone. He described the morning gatherings of the building crew, how they had read scripture together and prayed together and supported each other. He emphasized that this was not about individual spiritual heroics, but about learning to receive from God and from one another. He wrote about the gradual nature of transformation. Do not expect immediate, dramatic change, he penned carefully. The Lord who created the world in 6 days could certainly transform you in an instant if he chose. But more often, he works slowly, patiently, allowing you to integrate each lesson before moving to the next. Trust the process. Trust the pace. Trust that each day's small surrender is building something permanent and beautiful in your soul. He wrote about the inevitability of setbacks and how to handle them. There will be days when you forget and fall back into old patterns of striving and straining. There will be moments when exhaustion overwhelms you despite your best efforts to stay connected to the source. Do not despair in these moments. They are not failures, but reminders. Simply pause, breathe, remember the words, and begin again. The Lord who gives strength to the faint is not discouraged by our weakness. He expects it, welcomes it even, because it creates space for His strength to be revealed. As winter approached, Matthias completed the manuscript. It had grown into a substantial work, filling multiple scrolls with his careful script. He read through it one final time, making small corrections and additions, and then he felt a clear impression. This was meant to be shared, not hoarded. He brought the manuscript to Ezekiel, who had become not just a student, but a true friend. The merchant read it slowly over the course of several days, and when he finished, his eyes were bright with tears and excitement. "This must be copied and distributed," Ezekiel declared. "This testimony could help thousands, tens of thousands. I have the resources to commission scribes to make copies. Will you allow me to do this?" Matthias felt both hesitation and peace. Hesitation because he was a private man, not someone who sought attention. Peace because he knew this was right, that the story was not his to keep, but a gift to be shared freely. "Yes," he agreed, "but on one condition, that copies be given freely to those who cannot afford to pay. The wealthy can purchase them if they wish, but the poor must be able to access these words without cost. This truth is not a commodity to be sold, but a gift to be shared." Ezekiel grinned. "I would expect nothing less from you. Consider it done." In the months that followed, copies of Matthias's manuscript began to circulate throughout Jerusalem and beyond. They were read in synagogues and homes, by scholars and laborers, by the religious and the skeptical. Some dismissed the testimony as overly simplistic or pietistic, but many others found in it exactly what they needed: practical wisdom for living in constant dependence on God, hope that transformation was possible, encouragement that weakness acknowledged was stronger than strength pretended. Letters began to arrive from distant places. A rabbi in Alexandria had read the manuscript and wanted to discuss its theology. A widow in Jericho wrote to say that the words had given her hope to continue after her husband's death. A young scribe in Caesarea reported that an entire community of believers had formed around the practice of reading the manuscript together and applying its principles. Matthias read each letter with wonder and gratitude. The ripples continued to spread wider and wider, touching lives he would never meet, planting seeds that would grow long after he was gone. It was humbling and overwhelming and deeply satisfying, not because he took credit for any of it, but because he was privileged to witness God's faithfulness, to see how one small act of surrender could cascade into transformation for multitudes. As another year turned and Matthias entered his 46th year, he found himself reflecting on the nature of legacy. His walls would eventually crumble. All physical structures eventually do. His manuscript might be lost or forgotten with time, but the truths he had learned, the lives he had touched, the way he had lived, these were eternal, woven into the fabric of God's ongoing work in the world. One spring morning, as he sat in his usual spot in the temple courts, a young man approached him nervously. The youth couldn't have been more than 17, with the soft face of one who had not yet been hardened by life's difficulties. He stood before Matthias, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly wanting to speak, but unsure how to begin. "I know who you are," the young man finally blurted out. "You're the builder who found strength in weakness. My father told me about you before he died. He was one of the workers on the northern wall. His name was Benjamin. He used to come home from work and tell us about the things he was learning, about the words from Isaiah, about how you taught him to work differently. He died last month. His heart just stopped one day. But even at the end, he was at peace. He kept reciting those words, 'They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength.' I came to thank you for giving my father peace in his final years." Matthias stood and embraced the young man, feeling his body shake with suppressed sobs. "Your father was a good man and a fine builder," he said softly. "He taught me as much as I taught him. His peace came not from me, but from the Lord, through the words of the prophet. But I am honored to have walked beside him for a season." They sat together, and Matthias listened as the young man, whose name was Levi, poured out his grief and confusion. Benjamin had been the family's provider, and now they faced an uncertain future. Levi felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, the need to somehow fill his father's shoes, and he felt utterly inadequate to the task. The situation was so familiar that Matthias almost smiled. Here was another soul learning the lesson he himself had learned, that we are not adequate, that we were never meant to be adequate in our own strength, that our very inadequacy is the doorway to divine provision. "Let me tell you a story," Matthias said, and he shared his own journey, not from the manuscript, but from his heart, adapting it to speak directly to Levi's situation. He talked about being a father who lost his wife and felt he had failed his sons. He talked about working until he had nothing left and feeling utterly broken. He talked about the day when an old teacher had shared words that changed everything. Levi listened with the intensity of the desperate, and as Matthias spoke, he could see understanding dawning in the young man's eyes. "You're saying, I don't have to be my father," Levi said slowly. "I don't have to be strong enough or wise enough or capable enough by myself. I just have to show up and do my best and trust that God will provide what I lack." "Exactly," Matthias confirmed. "Your father learned this, and it gave him peace even in death. Now you are learning it, and it will give you life. Not easy life, but life lived in partnership with the divine rather than in isolated struggle." He gave Levi a copy of the Isaiah passage, carefully written on a small piece of parchment, and instructed him in the practical rhythms, the morning prayers, the throughout-the-day pauses, the evening gratitude. He invited him to return any time he needed to talk, to process, to be reminded of the truth when the weight became too heavy. As Levi departed, walking with a lighter step than when he had arrived, Matthias felt the familiar satisfaction of having passed on the gift he had received. This was his true work now, his calling, not building walls of stone, but helping to rebuild human hearts, not laying physical foundations, but helping others discover the eternal foundation that never shifts or cracks. The years continued their march, each one bringing new faces, new stories, new opportunities to share the ancient words made new. Matthias grew older, his beard turning from silver to white, his body moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age. But his eyes remained clear and his spirit strong, because he had learned the secret that sustained the prophet Isaiah himself, that those who wait upon the Lord do indeed renew their strength, that they can run and not be weary, walk and not faint. His sons visited when they could, bringing grandchildren who climbed on his lap and begged for stories. Matthias would tell them about the walls he had built, about the people he had met, about the words that changed his life. And always, he would end with the same message: remember, my little ones, that you are never alone, never left to your own resources. The Lord who made the heavens and the earth is the same Lord who gives power to the faint. When you are weak, he is strong. When you are tired, he carries you. When you feel you cannot continue, he renews your strength. This is the truth that will sustain you through all your days. And indeed, those grandchildren would grow up carrying these truths, passing them on to their own children in turn, an unbroken chain of testimony stretching forward through generations, yet unborn. One evening, as the sun set over Jerusalem in a spectacular display of crimson and gold, Matthias climbed slowly to the top of the northern wall. His old joints protested the ascent, but he persevered, wanting one more time to see the city from this vantage point, the place where so much of his transformation had occurred. He stood there as the light faded, watching the city transition from day to night, seeing lamps being lit in windows all across Jerusalem. Smoke rose from evening fires. The sound of prayers and conversation drifted on the air. Life continued its eternal rhythms, generations rising and falling, but the truths he had learned and shared were permanent, woven into the eternal fabric of divine reality. He thought about the old teacher who had first shared these words with him, and he wondered if that mysterious figure had once stood here, too, looking over the city, marveling at how God worked through weakness, how divine strength manifested most clearly in human fragility. "Thank you," Matthias whispered into the gathering darkness. "Thank you for breaking me so you could remake me. Thank you for showing me that weakness is not failure, but opportunity. Thank you for every stone laid in exhaustion, every prayer prayed in desperation, every moment when I thought I could not continue, but found strength from beyond myself. It has all been gift, every moment, gift." The stars began to appear, one by one, tiny points of light in the vast darkness. Matthias thought of Isaiah's words about God bringing out the stars by number, calling each by name. That same God knew Matthias by name, had walked with him through every valley, had sustained him through every trial, had worked through his weakness to accomplish things he could never have imagined in his own strength. As he descended from the wall and made his way home through the now dark streets, Matthias felt a deep contentment settle over his soul. His life had not been easy or pain-free. He had known loss and grief, exhaustion and despair. But through it all, he had learned the most valuable lesson a human being can learn, that we are not the source, but the vessel, not the origin, but the conduit, not the strength, but the ones through whom strength flows. He reached his small house near the potter's gate, lit his lamp, and prepared for sleep. Before lying down, he recited once more, as he did every night, the words that had become the rhythm of his heartbeat. "Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." As the words faded into silence, Matthias closed his eyes, his breathing deepening into the rhythm of sleep. In his dreams, he was a young man again, standing before that first section of wall, feeling utterly overwhelmed and inadequate. But this time, he did not despair. This time, he simply paused, breathed deeply, and remembered he does not faint or grow weary. He gives power to the faint. And in that remembering, in that surrender, in that opening to strength beyond himself, he found the peace that passes understanding, the rest that comes not from having finished all the work, but from trusting that the work is ultimately not his to complete, only to participate in faithfully, one stone at a time, one day at a time, one breath at a time. The night deepened over Jerusalem, stars wheeling in their ancient courses overhead, the city settling into sleep. And in a small house near the potter's gate, an old builder rested in perfect peace, his labor complete, not because there was no more work to be done, but because he had learned the sacred art of leaving each day's work in the hands of the one who never sleeps, who never grows weary, who is always faithful to complete what he begins. If you found peace in Matthias's journey tonight, there is another story waiting for you, another testimony of faith meeting life's deepest challenges. Click the video on your screen now to continue your journey through these blessed stories, where the timeless wisdom of Scripture meets the human heart. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us, allowing us to continue creating content designed to bring you peace and spiritual refreshment. But for now, beloved listener, let yourself rest. Let the truths of this story settle deep into your spirit. Let the words of Isaiah become your own truth, your own testimony. Remember that you too are never alone, never left to your own resources, never expected to be strong enough in yourself. The Lord who gave strength to Matthias offers the same strength to you. The Lord who does not faint or grow weary is with you now, in this moment, ready to renew your strength as you wait upon Him. Close your eyes now. Breathe deeply. Feel the weight of your body sinking into rest, and know with certainty that transcends doubt that you are held, you are known, you are loved, and you are never, ever alone. They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Rest now, beloved. Rest in peace. Rest in hope. Rest in the everlasting arms of the God who never grows weary, who gives power to the faint, who increases strength to those who have no might. Rest now and be renewed. The years flowed like water through the ancient aqueducts of Jerusalem, each season marking its passage with festivals and harvests, births and burials, the eternal rhythm of life in the holy city. Matthias grew old with grace, his white beard now long and venerable, his hands gnarled like olive wood, but still capable of skilled work when needed. The walls he had built stood firm, witnessing the passage of countless pilgrims, the changing of seasons, the rise and fall of earthly powers. But more enduring than any stone wall was the legacy of transformation that continued to ripple outward from that first moment of surrender, that first reading of Isaiah's words in the temple courts. The community that had formed around the wall project had dispersed geographically, but they remained connected spiritually, bound by shared experience and the truth that had set them free from the tyranny of self-sufficiency. Letters arrived regularly from Galilee, where both of Matthias's sons now led thriving building communities. David wrote of a young apprentice who had nearly died from exhaustion trying to prove himself, until the crew introduced him to the practice of working in surrendered dependence. Jacob described how they had been commissioned to rebuild a synagogue damaged by earthquake, and how the entire project had become a spiritual retreat for the workers, each stone placed with prayer, each day begun with the reading of Isaiah 40. One letter particularly moved Matthias. It came from a granddaughter he had never met, daughter of Jacob, now 12 years old. She wrote in careful Hebrew script, "Grandfather, Father tells me you are the one who discovered the secret of the eagles. He says you learned to fly not by flapping harder, but by trusting the wind. I am learning this too. When my studies feel too difficult, when I cannot understand the Torah portion, I remember what Father taught me from your testimony. Even youths shall faint and be weary, but they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength." Yesterday, I stopped trying so hard to understand, and I just asked the Lord to help me see. And suddenly, the meaning became clear, like clouds parting to reveal the sun. Thank you for teaching my father so he could teach me. I hope to meet you someday and hear your stories. Matthias read the letter multiple times, each reading bringing tears to his old eyes. Here was the fourth generation touched by the truth he had received. His granddaughter, whom he had never held as a baby, was soaring on the same currents of grace that had lifted him from despair. The wind of the Spirit blew where it willed, across distance and time, connecting hearts that had never met in flesh, but were united in the eternal truth of divine provision. As his 80th year approached, Matthias found his body finally beginning to truly fail. The adaptations he had made, the rhythms of work and rest, the practice of drawing from strength beyond himself, all these had sustained him far longer than anyone expected. But now, even these practices could not stop the natural decline of a body that had lived a full life. His hands trembled constantly now. His legs could barely carry him from his house to the nearby square. His eyesight dimmed, making it difficult to read even the beloved scroll of Isaiah that had been his constant companion. Yet his spirit remained strong, even grew stronger as his body weakened. It was as though the principle he had learned decades ago was now being demonstrated in its most profound form. When the physical vessel was at its weakest, the spiritual reality shone most clearly. People noticed this. They would come to visit Matthias, ostensibly to care for him in his infirmity, but they would leave feeling themselves cared for, strengthened, renewed. One such visitor was a Roman centurion named Marcus, an unlikely pilgrim to the home of an elderly Jewish builder. Marcus had been stationed in Jerusalem for 3 years, and in that time he had heard whispers of the old builder who had learned to work in the strength of his God. The stories intrigued him, challenged his Roman conviction that strength was everything, that weakness was to be despised and destroyed. Marcus arrived one afternoon, still in his military dress, uncomfortable and out of place in the humble dwelling. Matthias, nearly blind now, could barely make out his visitor's form, but he heard the creak of leather and metal, smelled the oil used to maintain armor, and understood who had come. "You are welcome here," Matthias said simply, his voice thin but warm. "All who seek are welcome." Marcus, a man accustomed to commanding legions, found himself at a loss for words. Finally, he said, "I have conquered cities. I have led men into battle. I have never known defeat in combat. But I am defeated by life itself. My son died last year. Fever took him in 3 days. My wife turned away from me in her grief, blaming me for not being there when it happened. I was on campaign, you see, doing my duty. Now I return to an empty house, to a silent marriage, to a life that feels like ashes in my mouth. They tell me you found strength in weakness. I do not understand how that is possible. Strength is strength. Weakness is weakness. Matthias was quiet for a long moment, his sightless eyes seeming to look past the visible world into something deeper. When he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully shaped by 8 decades of living. I once believed as you do. I thought strength was the answer to every challenge, that if I could just be strong enough, wise enough, capable enough, I could protect those I loved from pain, could build a life that would never crumble. But I was wrong. Not because strength is bad, strength is good, a gift from God, but because I confused human strength with the only strength that truly sustains. He paused, wheezing slightly, and Marcus waited with unexpected patience. You lost your son, Matthias continued, his voice carrying a tenderness that made the hardened soldier's eyes sting. I lost my wife, and in that loss I learned that no amount of human strength can prevent death, can control life, can guarantee outcomes. We are not gods, though we try so hard to be. We are human, fragile, temporary as grass. And that is not a flaw in creation, it is the design. We were made to need. We were made to depend. We were made to draw our strength from the source of all strength. Marcus shook his head, struggling. But how does one do this? I do not know your God. I worship Mars, Jupiter, the gods of Rome. How does a soldier like me access this strength beyond strength? Matthias smiled, and despite his aged, failing body, the smile was radiant. The first step is the hardest. You must stop pretending you are sufficient. You must acknowledge that you cannot carry this grief alone, that you cannot fix your marriage through force of will, that you cannot resurrect your son or rewind time. You must say, as I learned to say, I cannot. I need help. I am weak. That is defeat, Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Matthias replied gently. That is truth, and truth is the beginning of freedom. Defeat is when you continue to strain under a burden you were never meant to carry, when you exhaust yourself trying to be God and finally collapse in despair. But surrender, surrender is different. Surrender is when you acknowledge your limitations and open yourself to receive what you cannot provide for yourself. Marcus sat in silence, the sounds of the city filtering through the window, children playing, merchants calling, the eternal heartbeat of Jerusalem. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was no longer the voice of a commander, but of a man vulnerable and afraid. Will you teach me? And so began an unlikely discipleship. The Roman centurion became a regular visitor to the home of the Jewish builder, and in that humble space, walls that had divided peoples and cultures for generations came down. Matthias could barely see, could barely move, but he could still speak truth, could still point the way to the source of all strength. He taught Marcus the words of Isaiah, explaining each phrase with stories from his own journey. He showed him how to pause in moments of overwhelming emotion, how to breathe and remember that he was not alone, how to offer his weakness to the God who gives power to the faint. Slowly, incrementally, Marcus began to change. The hardness in his eyes softened. He began to speak to his wife with gentleness instead of stoic silence, sharing his grief instead of hiding it. And in that vulnerability, their marriage began to heal. One evening, as summer turned to autumn and the air carried the first hint of coming rains, Marcus brought his wife to meet Matthias. Julia was a Roman woman, educated and refined, who had never expected to find wisdom in a Jewish builder's home. But as Matthias spoke, as he shared the truths that had carried him through his own valley of shadow, she wept openly. I blame my husband for our son's death, she confessed, her voice breaking. I told myself that if he had been home, if he had loved us enough to prioritize us over Rome, our boy would still live. But that is madness, isn't it? Death comes when it comes. Marcus could not have prevented it. I have been punishing him for being human, for not being a God who could control fate. Matthias reached out with his trembling hand, and Julia took it, holding the aged fingers gently. You are learning what took me years to understand, he said. We cannot control outcomes. We can only choose how we respond to what comes. You can continue in blame and isolation, or you can turn toward each other, sharing the burden rather than carrying it alone. Your son is gone. Nothing will change that truth. But your marriage can live. Your future can hold meaning. Choose life, child. Choose to let the Lord carry what you cannot. That night, Marcus and Julia left Matthias's home holding hands, talking quietly, beginning the difficult work of rebuilding what grief had nearly destroyed. And Matthias, alone in his simple dwelling, offered a prayer of thanksgiving that even in his weakness, even as his body failed, the truth he carried continued to bring life to others. The Festival of Tabernacles came again, as it had every year of Matthias's long life. He could not build a sukkah himself anymore. His hands would not cooperate. His body would not sustain the work. But Asher, now a master builder himself with his own crew, came with his apprentices and constructed a beautiful temporary shelter in Matthias's small courtyard. They adorned it with palm branches and fruit, creating a fragrant, peaceful space. On the first night of the festival, a remarkable gathering occurred. Somehow word had spread, and they came from all directions. Ezra, now middle-aged but still carrying his characteristic enthusiasm. Old Simeon's son, carrying on his father's legacy of skilled craftsmanship. Tobias, who had been running from debt and found instead a reason to live. Levi, the young man whose father Benjamin had died peacefully because of truth learned on the walls. Marcus and Julia, the Roman couple learning to grieve together. Ezekiel, the merchant and his family, and dozens more, each one touched directly or indirectly by the testimony of a weary builder who had learned to work in divine strength. They crowded into and around the sukkah, bringing food and wine, songs and stories. As the stars appeared overhead, visible through the loose roof of branches as tradition required, they took turns sharing how the truth of Isaiah 40 had transformed their lives. Each testimony was a variation on the same theme. I was at the end of my resources. I learned to stop striving and start trusting. I found strength I never knew existed. When all had spoken, they turned to Matthias, asking him to close the gathering with a blessing. He struggled to his feet, supported by Asher on one side and Marcus on the other. Jew and Gentile, old and young, united in their support of this fragile vessel through whom grace had flowed. Matthias stood there, swaying slightly, his blind eyes raised toward the stars he could no longer see but knew were there. And in a voice that was surprisingly strong, that seemed to draw from a well deeper than his failing body, he began to recite, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned." He continued through the entire 40th chapter of Isaiah, every word etched in his memory by decades of meditation, by countless repetitions in moments of weakness and strength, by the lived experience of every phrase. The gathering listened in reverent silence as the ancient words flowed from the old builder's lips. And it was as though the prophet himself spoke, as though time collapsed and Isaiah stood among them, proclaiming truth that transcended centuries. When he reached the familiar climax, his voice somehow grew even stronger. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The final words hung in the air like stars, and for a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. Then spontaneously they began to sing, an ancient song of Zion, voices blending in harmony, tears flowing freely, joy and sorrow mingling in the mysterious way they do when truth is encountered at its deepest level. Matthias sat down slowly, exhausted but content. This was enough, more than enough. If he died tonight, in this moment, it would be a perfect completion. He had received the gift of truth in his darkest hour, had lived that truth faithfully for decades, had seen it multiply and spread beyond anything he could have imagined. What more could a man ask? But his time had not yet come. The festival week passed in fellowship and celebration, and when the temporary shelters were dismantled and life returned to its normal rhythms, Matthias continued. Days became weeks, weeks became months. He grew progressively weaker, spending most of his time now on his sleeping mat, tended by a rotation of those whose lives he had touched. One morning in early spring, as almond blossoms began to appear on trees throughout Jerusalem, Matthias woke to find his vision had cleared. It was not physical sight. His eyes remained clouded with age, but an inner vision, sharp and vivid. He could see, as though present in the flesh, his sons in Galilee, both now old men themselves, teaching their grandchildren to work in surrendered dependence. He could see the copy of his manuscript in Alexandria being read by lamplight to a gathering of believers. He could see workers in distant Ephesus laying stones for a new building, pausing to pray the prayers he had taught. He could see ripples spreading, endless ripples, from one small stone dropped in still water so many years ago. And he understood this was farewell. His work was complete. The testimony had been given. The truth had been lived. The seeds had been planted. What came next was out of his hands, as indeed it had always been. He had been the vessel, never the source, and now the vessel was ready to return to clay. He called for Asher, who came immediately, bringing his own son, a boy of 10 named Matthias, in honor of the old builder. I need you to write something for me, the old man whispered, his voice barely audible. My hands can no longer form letters, but there are final words that must be preserved. Asher brought parchment and ink, and as Matthias spoke, he carefully recorded the words. To all who read this in years to come, I was not a prophet or a priest, not a king or a sage. I was a builder who forgot how to build, a man who reached the end of his strength and thought it was the end of everything. But it was not an end. It was a beginning. In my weakness, I discovered the only strength that truly matters. In my exhaustion, I found rest that does not depend on circumstances. In my surrender, I gained freedom I had never known in all my striving. The words of Isaiah chapter 40 saved my life, but more than that, they showed me how to truly live. I pass them on to you not as dry doctrine, but as lived reality, as bread that sustained me through decades, as water that never failed to refresh. Test them. Live them. Let them carry you when you can no longer carry yourself. Remember, you are not the source, but the vessel. You are not the foundation, but what is built upon it. You are not the wind, but the eagle who trusts the currents to hold. And when you learn this, truly learn it in your bones and blood and daily experience, you will find that weakness is not something to be feared or denied, but the very doorway through which divine strength enters our lives. I go now to my fathers, to sleep in the earth until the resurrection. But the truth I leave behind is eternal, for it was never mine to begin with. It belongs to the everlasting God who does not faint or grow weary, who gives power to the faint, who increases strength to those who have no might. Wait upon the Lord, dear Rita. Wait upon Him in your exhaustion, in your fear, in your inadequacy, and He will renew your strength. You will mount up with wings like eagles. You will run and not be weary. You will walk and not faint. This is my testimony. This is my legacy. This is the truth that sustained me from despair to death and will sustain you in your own journey. Rest in Him. Always rest in Him. Asher finished writing with tears streaming down his face. He read the words back to Matthias, who nodded slowly, satisfied. "Good," he whispered. "Now I can rest." That night, as Jerusalem settled into sleep under a canopy of stars, as pilgrims dreamed in their lodgings and priests prepared for morning sacrifices, as the eternal city continued its eternal rhythms, Matthias ben Aaron closed his eyes for the final time. His breathing grew shallow, then stopped. And those who kept vigil said that in his last moments a smile of profound peace settled on his ancient features, and his lips moved, forming silent words they all recognized. They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. The funeral 3 days later was attended by hundreds. Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, young and old, all came to honor a man who had taught them to honor their weakness, who had showed them strength beyond strength. They buried him in the family tomb outside the city, laying him to rest beside his beloved Dinah, their separation in death temporary, their reunion in resurrection certain. But Matthias's true memorial was not carved in stone. It lived in the hearts of all who had learned from him, in the practices they continued, in the truth they passed on to their children and their children's children. The walls he built eventually crumbled, as all human works must. But the souls he helped rebuild stood firm, eternal, monuments of grace that would never fall. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. Empires rose and fell. Jerusalem itself was destroyed and rebuilt again. But through all the tumult and change, through exile and return, through darkness and light, the testimony of Matthias, the builder, endured. His manuscript was copied and recopied, preserved by those who recognized its value, passed hand to hand across generations and continents. And always, always, the words of Isaiah chapter 40 continued to speak to weary souls, to exhausted hearts, to those who had reached the end of themselves and needed to discover the beginning of divine provision. The promise remained true. The Lord does not faint or grow weary. He gives power to the faint. To those who have no might, He increases strength. This truth sustained martyrs in arenas and monks in deserts, mothers in childbirth and warriors in battle, scholars in their studies and farmers in their fields. It crossed every boundary of culture and time, for it spoke to something universal in human experience. We all grow weary. We all reach our limits. We all need strength beyond ourselves. And to all who waited upon the Lord, who stopped striving and started trusting, who surrendered their weakness and received divine strength, the promise was fulfilled. They mounted up with wings like eagles. They ran and were not weary. They walked and did not faint. The story of Matthias became a whispered legend, then a remembered tale, then a written testimony preserved in communities of faith. And whenever someone new discovered his story, whenever weary eyes fell upon his words, the same transformation began again, the letting go of self-sufficiency, the opening to grace, the discovery that weakness acknowledged is stronger than strength pretended. For this was the eternal truth, the unbreakable promise, the foundation that never shifts. The Lord is the everlasting God, creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable, and he gives power to the faint. Always he gives power to the faint. Now, dear listener, as this story comes to its close, let it also be the beginning of your own journey into this truth. Wherever you are, whatever burdens you carry, whatever weakness you fear to acknowledge, know that you are not alone. The same Lord who sustained Matthias sustains you. The same strength that flowed through him is available to you. The same promise that changed his life can change yours. You need not be strong enough. You need only be open enough, open to receive what you cannot provide for yourself, open to strength beyond your own resources, open to the wind that carries eagles aloft without effort or strain. Close your eyes now. Feel the weight of your body supported by what lies beneath you. Just as the earth holds you without strain, just as gravity works without your effort, so the Lord upholds you without fail. You can stop striving. You can release control. You can rest. Breathe deeply, slowly. With each breath, release a little more tension, a little more worry, a little more of the burden you were never meant to carry alone. The Lord does not faint or grow weary. Let his strength be yours. Let his peace settle over you like evening falling on Jerusalem, gentle and inevitable and good. They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. You are waiting now. In this moment of quiet rest, you are practicing the sacred art of dependence, the holy discipline of trust. And even now, strength is being renewed in places deeper than you can sense. Work is being done that you cannot measure. Grace is flowing that you cannot quantify. But you will know it in the morning. You will know it when you wake refreshed. You will know it when you face your day and find you can continue, can take the next step, can lift the next stone. Not because you became superhuman overnight, but because you finally accepted your humanity and opened yourself to divine provision. Sleep now, beloved soul. Sleep in the peace that Matthias found, the peace that countless others have found, the peace that awaits you in surrender. Let the ancient words wash over you one final time. The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Rest now. Rest deeply. Rest in the everlasting arms of the God who never sleeps, who watches over you with tender care, who holds you secure through this night and all nights to come. You are safe. You are held. You are loved beyond measure. And when you wake, you will be renewed. If you found peace in Matthias's journey tonight, there is another story waiting for you. Another testimony of faith, meeting life's deepest challenges. Click the video on your screen now to continue your journey through these blessed stories, where the timeless wisdom of Scripture meets the human heart. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us. But for now, beloved listener, simply rest. The stories will be there tomorrow. God's truth is eternal. For this moment, let everything else fall away except the simple, profound reality that you are held in love, sustained by grace, and invited to rest in perfect peace. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and know that the same God who renewed Matthias' strength is renewing yours even now in ways you cannot yet perceive but will surely experience. Rest now, dear one. Rest in Him. Rest and be renewed. Silence.